Welcome to Perspectives in Business. I am Juan Carlos Giraldo from Boston, United States. Business leaders and corporations profess their dedication to sustainability and ESG metrics. But the question is, do they really do it? Christopher Marquis is the author of the book The Profiteers, How Business Privatizes Profits and Socializes Costs. Christopher Marquis is the Sinyi Professor of Chinese Management at the University of Cambridge in the UK. In this episode, we highlight interesting points from his book, such as corporate gaslighting, ESG as a toxic term, externalities, and more. I highly recommend his book. Hello, Chris. It's a pleasure to have you as a guest on my podcast. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks so much, Juan Carlos. Really great to be with you.
Thank you so much. Chris, since I started in this fascinating world of sustainability and ESG, I have taken courses and read many books. And now I am reading your book, The Profiteers, How Business Privatizes Profits and Socializes Costs, which I almost finished. I would like to start this conversation by asking you what inspired you to write this book?
Well, it's sort of interesting story. The name, The Profiteers, How Business Privatizes Profit and Socializes Cost, foregrounds the critique that I have in the book around how basically the legal, financial, corporate systems and culture are really set up to externalize costs. This idea of externalities, which is companies that, or not just companies, but any sort of entity, maybe they don't actually pay the true cost of their production, but actually society and the environment, for instance, end up actually taking care of some of those costs. So this is a critique that I have. However, my inspiration was interestingly from so many of the entrepreneurs that are actually working creatively to internalize those costs. And I think this is something that is important for us to think about as we're talking about sustainable business. A lot of sustainable business focuses on stakeholders.
Yep.
Employees, customers, community, et cetera. But actually, it doesn't really get to the core essence, the core business model of the company. And I think these companies that are really focusing on internalizing costs end up, being great examples of how companies, if we're going to hold companies, to the task of being sustainable, we need to focus on actually the business, not what they're doing necessarily for stakeholders.
Thank you for this answer. Your book creates a field with great intriguing and provoking concepts, and one of which is the commons. Could you elaborate on how this concept is related to corporations and industries in this modern context?
So, many of us, maybe all of us in school sort of studied this famous parable of the tragedy of the commons, which is when, actually here in Cambridge, where I am right now and where I teach, we actually have these commonses where cows graze. Probably there's some sort of regulation or agreement on it, but back a long time ago, when shepherds were out grazing their various sheep or cow or whatever, there was not those agreements, and so over time, they would learn, farmers or shepherds would learn, oh, maybe I'll get another cow. This is basically as a free resource. Company, the cows can go and chew grass all summer, and then wow, I have two cows at the end, and it's like doubled my income. Well, actually, this free resource is not necessarily a free resource. It's actually an example of, a social, resource or an environmental resource that in the book, I argue companies really need to be thinking about and taking account of. And so an issue which I think we're facing in this world today is something called sort of overshoot. And this topic is where, actually if, companies or whomever are taking advantage of, these free resources, that can only go on for so long. There's examples of the cod fishing in your area in sort of New England and Boston where, for a long time there was overfishing. The North Atlantic Ocean was basically a commons, and fishermen, they could just keep taking, and they bought new boats, and the more boats they bought, the more fish they could bring in. But what happens is that there's not a gradual decline. There's actually, things are going really pretty well for a while, and then they collapse. And, this is unfortunately, the result of tragedy of the commons is usually collapse. And, there's estimates now that we're overshooting our world's resources by a factor of almost 2 to 1. So, hopefully we'll solve things before this collapse comes. But at some point, if we keep going on the current trajectory, it's not going to be a pretty situation.
It's true. And also, water, for example, is a real example of one
Yes.
of the overuse all the time from companies for agriculture, etc. Speaking about industries and corporations, Chris, there is a extreme. I think the core of this book is the term corporate gaslighting. It's kind of disappointing, right? That the companies, try to cheat at one point. Can you elaborate a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So, this idea of externalities is a concept that I sort of orient the book around, companies privatizing profit, socializing cost is, a pretty neutral, typically concept from economics or, financial accountants sometimes try to calculate these externalities. And I think what that really misses is that actually behind the scenes, businesses are engaging in a lot of, very tricky PR campaigns, communication, and lobbying to actually avoid those costs, and also actually, change our perception within society that, those shouldn't be companies' responsibility, they should be our responsibility. So, one of the examples that I give is you know I give a number of examples from the plastics industry because that's sort of an interesting area that where it's happened a lot.
Yeah, you mentioned that.
Where these organizations that are called like Keep America Beautiful, are putting out these campaigns around, people start pollution, people should stop it. Well, this actually is two of the gaslighting techniques that I describe, and I go through a whole list of them. So one is something called astroturfing. So Keep America Beautiful sounds like a very grassroots, well-meaning organization, but actually it's backed by the packaging and beverage industry. So, AstroTurf is, fake grass basically. So typically organizations like that would be seen as grassroots organizations. So the fact that it's artificial grassroots, astroturf is a term that's been used. And the second, in regards to like this tagline of people start pollution, people should stop it, is this idea of sort of it's not my responsibility, where, companies are trying to make us think that, oh, pollution is just, we need to be recycling and putting things in the right bin, and this will solve everything. But actually, another topic in the book is that's not the case.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Chris, nowadays we are navigating through a challenging times. In many
Right.
ways, particular here in United States, we are living in an election year.
Yes.
And the term ESG has become a point of debate. If you agree with ESG, you are good. If you don't agree with ESG, you are bad. So it's crazy. And experts, professors, opinion leaders, and even, for example, the CEO of BlackRock, Larry Fink, are debating whether we should no longer use the term or not. In my opinion, is fantastic term. It's a great metrics and a great framework to work. So in your book, you mentioned is ESG now is a toxic term. Why is that? How you get this conclusion?
Yeah, I mean more from in the PR standpoint. I think that companies' accountability on environmental, social governance topics is tremendously important and essential. I think to long-term sustainability of the planet and society and companies. And the EU has actually been, I think, very leading on this through a number of new sort of directives and laws, like the corporate sustainability reporting directive. I sort of say, I think I call it sort of the toxic trio of letters, and I think it's because, and it relates to this corporate gaslighting idea, where there is this sort of anti woke, so to speak, ideology where anything that sounds like it's for sort of social justice or environmentalism or climate, there's this knee jerk negative reaction to it. In many cases, these get sort of followed up through policy
Mhm.
prescriptions or laws in US states like Texas and Florida, for instance, have these sort of anti
Correct.
ESG investing laws. Well, actually, if you look at some of the underlying so-called research or positions on that, a lot of it can be traced back to, these very right-wing policy organizations like the Heritage Foundation, funded by the Koch brothers and others in the fossil fuel industry.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree with you. I think that holding companies accountable and measuring and reporting on their environmental, social governance factors is hugely essential. But this is being twisted around in ways that try to get people all riled up
Mm-hmm.
that somehow some social justice program, and it's not. It's actually about companies being responsible and better in many ways.
Right. I think they are using it as a political weapon, to try to
Exactly,
manipulate
exactly,
the society,
exactly.
you know?
I think I call it sort of one gaslighting technique, sort of exploiting cultural wedge issues.
Right.
This idea of a wedge, I mean, it sort of separates people into two different camps of, ESG
Exactly.
bad, ESG good. Yeah.
Yeah.
I,
No, it's insane. Let's talk about externalities. You
yes.
present there are two negative externalities and positive
Sure.
externalities, and they are related with e-commerce. For example, positive with e-commerce. For example, with infrastructure. What are your thoughts about
Sure.
these couple two different externalities?
I think it's a great question. And I think that in many cases, people forget about the positive externalities. I mean, I think a
Yes,
lot of times attention is directed to the negative ones, like for instance, carbon pricing, or carbon markets. So that, this is an attempt to put values on, the negative externalities of, greenhouse gas emissions. But and there's and in my book, I actually a big part of my critique, as mentioned, is around these negative externalities. However, I think we also need to be thinking a lot about positive externalities,
certainly. Yeah.
because this is the way, you think of a company that, really is trying to sort of examine its business operations and internalize these costs. Actually, what thinking about, positive externalities gives is actually a way to think about, how to contribute back to the world. And, the third part of the book, I use the term regeneration, and this is, a little bit of a buzzword nowadays. However, I think that it's a very useful concept because it actually directs attention to positive externalities. So an example I give in the book on this is Patagonia. So actually, Patagonia, when they founded Patagonia Provisions line in 2012, they had not done agricultural production previously. Patagonia Provisions is a line of business of theirs that produces food and beer and a variety of other things. But they realized actually, if you do agricultural production right, not like sort of monoculture factory farms, uh, but actually the way that it's actually the much more natural way. It's the way that our, sort of our grandparents did it, where you have sort of diversity of plants and you have animals, sort of
The classic one.
involved. Yeah, exactly. That actually you can, restore ecosystems, you can rebuild soil and the overall ecology. And so, this is what in many ways in agriculture, what's meant by regenerative agriculture. But actually, this is an idea can be applied much more generally, like thinking about how can we as a business help rebuild communities, rebuild society, and also rebuild the natural environment.
Before wrapping up, are two things going on hand in hand. One is transforming underlying systems and the short term, right? How can we make those change with a short term mindset? And you mentioned these a couple concepts very well in your book. How we can do? We need transforming underlying systems, which is a fact. We need it, but with a short term thinking, it's kind very
Yeah,
challenging.
right. Yeah, I mean, any sort of system change effort is a challenge, and part of it, and it also a lot of this is about a trade off between long and short term. Think about long term value versus short term value. But in general, the idea of system change is really about altering the cultural and institutional frameworks that society operates by. This may seem like a very abstract or sort of impossible thing to do, but it's actually done many times in the past. Just in regards to the system that I'm aiming to change with my book and many other entrepreneurs and thinkers is regards to this shareholder primacy paradigm that actually didn't come into being until, is at least deeply institutionalized until the 1970s, and did so through a bunch of laws, other practices like, sort of options, incentives for executives. And so what I advocate in the book is, we need to be operating on many different levels. We can't just be focusing on one sort of solution. We need a variety of policy prescriptions and changes, be it sort of structure of companies and market structures and incentive, and also companies' advocacy on these topics and work in industry consortiums. And then also, I think, helping reorient consumers as well. There is a lot of discussion of conscious consumers helping make this transition. And I'm slightly leery about this because there's so much information that consumers are getting again and again. There are new companies that pop up, like 3 years ago we had never heard of Shein or Temu, that now dominate this fast fashion ecosystem. So I think that working as responsible businesses to actually help shape consumer ideas about what a responsible consumer is really important too.
Chris, is there anything that you would like to add? And please feel free to share with the audience where people can get your book. I highly recommend it.
Sure. Well, thank you, Juan Carlos, for recommending it. My website is my name, chrismarquis.com, so people can find me there. LinkedIn, I'm also pretty active. People should certainly feel free to sort of connect to me and follow me. And also the book, The Profiteers, you can get it at, basically any online book source. So really appreciate the opportunity to talk about it to your listeners, and appreciate their support and connections.
No, thank you. Thank you. It's a really good book. Chris, I would like to say thank you for your time.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you so much for the time, Juan Carlos.
Thank you so much. I am Juan Carlos Giraldo from Boston, United States. Thank you so much, everyone. The views, information, or opinions expressed in this episode are my own and do not represent my employer's views.